Tabletopped will start after the following messages.
Are you looking for something comfortable to wear and keep your brain warm while playing tabletop games? Daily Dose of Yarn makes handmade, customized beanies for all of your style and comfort needs. She can even help you with a custom beanie to represent your favorite character. Check out Daily Dose of Yarn on Instagram and Etsy to order your new favorite beanie today.
Take a look around you, human. What do you see? Actually, don't answer that. Why would I bother listening to you when I know you'll just get it wrong? You'll start naming objects and places, but that chair you're sitting in isn't just a chair. That book you're holding isn't just a book. Even the planet your kind is on the brink of ruining isn't just a planet. They're all me. Everything you've ever seen or touched is a part of me. Yes, even you vain, filthy animal. This is the opening paragraph to my debut book, The Milky Way, an autobiography of our galaxy, by me, Dr. Moiya McTier. I'm an astrophysicist and a folklorist, and I wrote this book because I want to give you, anyone who is interested in space, a view of how our Milky Way galaxy has evolved over the last 10 billion plus years. I also wanted to give you a sense of how our human understanding of space has evolved from mythology to the telescopes that we sent out of our atmosphere. I hope that you would enjoy this book. You can find it anywhere books are sold, as long as it's after August 16th. The book is called The Milky Way, an autobiography of our galaxy. People seem to like it so far, so I hope you pick it up and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you for potentially reading.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Tabletopped. Today we are talking to folklorist and astrophysicist Dr. Moiya McTier about world building from a place of science. She's the host of the ExoLore podcast. I encourage you to check it out. And everyone, it's such a good conversation. I can't wait for you guys to listen to it. Also, if you enjoy the podcast, please leave us a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. It really helps the show, and I'm going to start actually reading out some of these reviews, so leave one and be funny or don't. Either way, I really appreciate it, and I hope you enjoy the interview. Welcome back to another episode of Tabletopped, and I am so excited to welcome our guest today. She has degrees from Harvard in both astrophysics and folklore, a PhD from Columbia in astronomy. She's the creator of the ExoLore podcast, which is fantastic, and the Fate and Fabled show on the PBS Story channel on YouTube. She also wrote a book coming out that you may have heard as an ad on our previous week's podcast and probably somewhere in here today, called The Milky Way, an autobiography of our galaxy. Dr. Moiya McTier, it is so good to have you. Welcome to Tabletopped.
Thanks, Nick. It's good to be here. That was such a nice introduction.
I had to write it down. Yeah, it's so good to meet you. I really enjoy your work on ExoLore. For those who are not familiar, ExoLore is a great podcast in which Moiya sits down with somebody and world builds, starting either from science or from like an idea that you want to build into creating an entire world. Mm-hmm. Can you speak a little bit about how you got started there and like what the podcast is all about and what drives you to create these worlds all the time?
Yeah, sure. The idea for ExoLore goes way back. When I was in college and I decided to study both astronomy and folklore, to do that as a double major, I had to write a thesis that sat at the intersection of those two fields. So I ended up writing a science fiction novel that was set on a real exoplanet that I studied with data from the Kepler spacecraft. And I didn't know it at the time. I didn't even know the word world building, but that is what I was doing. And then when I got to grad school for my PhD, I didn't want to give up folklore. So I started teaching workshops about how you could let science inspire your creativity. Eventually, that turned into a live show in New York that got cut down by COVID. So then it was a YouTube show. And then I was like, wait, actually, these conversations are more interesting than how we look when we have them. So it turned into a podcast. And now... this is something that I just really love doing. I love the intersection of science and folklore more than I love either one of them on its own. So in the podcast, sometimes we build worlds from scratch, but sometimes I also analyze other worlds or interview world builders to steal their tricks. And sometimes it's just like a how-to episode. I did one episode on how to build a culture from scratch. So it explores all facets of world building.
That's so awesome. Also, I love So I in preparation for this, I went onto your website and I sort of looked around, saw the different things that you put on there. One of them was that you had a theater kid background, as did I. And I just thought when you were talking that the most theater kid thing to do when you're doing a science project is to write a full science fiction book.
Yes. How do I get a degree in astronomy from Harvard? Write a science fiction novel. That's it.
Yeah, totally. And I just really want to have you on because I think that our podcast is all about, TTRPGs and tabletop games, but also storytelling. And a really big part of that is world building. As anybody who's tried to run sort of a homebrew game or write a book or anything knows that it can get really complex really, really fast. And I always really loved that you started with like a scientific basis. And so I want to kind of interview you today about how people can use science and, things from our worlds that will ground you in making your own sort of world from scratch. And I also, since I love folklore, will probably be steering directly into that as well at some point. So to get us started, why don't you tell us a little bit about what science can do to like base your world that you're starting to build and like why you like starting there?
Great question. World building is hard.
Yes.
You know it. Anyone who's built a world knows it. Anyone who has read a book like really carefully knows that world building is hard. So I think that the easiest way to world build is to do it the way nature does. And that means that I can use the science that I've learned about planet formation to help myself build my worlds. So I know from science that when a world forms, if you're talking about a planet when you say world, which is not always the case, that these planets form around stars, and the characteristics of these planets depend on the characteristic of the star. And so I think that that's just a really easy place to start because that's where nature does. But also, when you root your world in facts and science, it makes it easier for your audience to engage with your world and your story. I say that people come to stories with expectations, and most of those expectations are based in the rules of our reality. We have expectations about how gravity works or how physics works. We have expectations about how people interact with each other. We have expectations about like what is a day and what is a year. And if you are building a new world and you're changing one of those things, if you don't make it clear that you're changing it and how it affects the world, your audience is still coming in with that expectation. And when that expectation is broken, it takes them out of your story. So, yeah.
Yeah, totally. Honestly, I've had experiences in the past either playing in games or like listening to stories where it's like, yes, it's a week of work and you'll be paid this much. And by the way, a week is 12 days and days are this long or whatever. And I think that I kind of had taken for granted how much of our reality we actually bring into the stories that we consume, and how important it is to make a new reality that at least acknowledges those biases so that you can create something that people can put themselves into a little bit more easy. Like in a kind of, adjacent area, we've talked in the past about how genre tropes and kind of expectations when it comes to how a story feels, if it's like a certain type of story, can really help place people into a setting very quickly.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of goes exactly to what you're saying, is that the actual feeling that we have and the knowledge that we bring from our world is going to be coming with us no matter what when we go into a story. So make sure that you are acknowledging that, and if you're changing everything drastically, acknowledge that too, so that they can come along with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one small example that comes to mind is I just did a one-off D&D session over the weekend, and for some reason, my party and we started really haggling at a marketplace, and so we started getting into the currency system. And I know it's common in a lot of RPGs to have currency systems where there's like a gold, a silver, and a copper or something.
Sure.
And I assume, being a human from Earth, that gold is more valuable than silver, which is more valuable than copper. But that is because of what has happened here on Earth.
Yeah.
It's because, well, it's false scarcity, but like we have manufactured the currency system so that gold is more valuable because it's rarer than silver, and because it's more useful for what we need it to do. So like think about those things when you're building your world.
Yeah, like you could totally base an entire sort of country or city-state or even world off the fact that it's really hard to grow agriculture on this world. And so like seashells that can be ground up into fertilizer are like the most expensive thing and are used as trading pieces and things like that.
Exactly. Yeah. Why are we trading with metals? Like, why aren't we using seeds?
We have those. We have a lot of those.
Exactly. So think about what your world has, and that will determine what the things are used for.
So real quick before we continue on, I think everyone will probably want to know, what class and kind of character did you play in your one-off D&D session?
I love druids. I love magic creatures. So I grew up in the woods, so I have a very strong personal tie to nature. So I usually play druids. This past time, I was a gnome druid, except the DM had this fun little twist where my character was abandoned in the woods, so didn't know exactly what her race was, but she was small, so she assumed gnome. And then by the end of the campaign, it was revealed that actually she was just created by the land because the land needed her, and she was really a dragon. And I loved it.
That's so cool. Yeah, the difference again between what we think we know and what the storyteller knows is also, it's just so important. It's so cool.
Absolutely.
So back to world building. So when you start from scratch, either if you are planning to make a world yourself, or you are trying to make something into a storytelling device, so like a world for a book or something like that, what sort of scientific things do you like to start with? Is it just things that interest you? So is it always kind of like physics and astronomy and things like that? Or do you pick kind of the same things each time that you really like to start with it to get your teeth into what the world is like?
I like to switch it up. So I have developed this process for building worlds from scratch. And the first step in the process is to set your intention. We're going to be recording our episode tomorrow where we build a world.
Very excited.
So pay attention, Nick, because this is the process we're going to go through. It starts with your intention. And I love how you brought up earlier that the genre tropes can really set people's expectations. When you're in the intention part of the process, that's when you decide genre. That's when you decide like aesthetic or vibe. And it's where you put in place anything you know you want your world to be like. So if you want your world to be one that is good for like a climate fiction story, that will lead you to make different decisions than if you wanted a world where like queer people were happy and were thriving, you know?
Yeah, right. So if you were going from like a cultural standpoint, like you mentioned, a world where queer people are, do not face the discrimination that they do here, how would you go about that? Do you go about that scientifically, or do you instead think of like folklore, like drawing from your folklore experience, like say, okay, culturally this happens, and then reverse engineer it from that?
Both.
Okay.
And it's all kind of working together. I say that it's 6 steps, but it's like 6 steps that you do all at once. So let's say we were trying to build a world like where queer people were really comfortable. I would start to think about what queerness means and what I want it to mean in this moment. So let's say, for example, in this context, we want that to mean that people can mate with whoever they want, and there's no societal pressure to mate with a specific type of person. Well, then you can start thinking about the biology that might lead to that. In the past, when I've built worlds for this purpose, I have built hermaphroditic species that could change their sex at whim. I have built species where there's external fertilization, so it's not like sex. It's not like intercourse that makes it. I have even thought of worlds where if you don't have to gestate a baby in your body, how might that lead to different gender norms in the world? So there are a lot of ways that you can take it. And I think that like you can give 20 people the same prompt of build a world for queer people, and they can take it in different directions, even if they're all being inspired by the science.
Oh, that's so cool. I love that you said that like you start with intention, because I think that in my artistic practice that specificity is always so important, but also in such short supply. And I think that by saying, okay, my intention to start out is that I want a world in which this, in my case, this story can take place. This story has X factors. What kind of world can create a place where these factors exist? Yeah. Okay, so you have the intention now. You start kind of building back from there. Then are you starting to loop in sort of the scientific process of like, this is the physical setting in which these things can occur into, and then move on from there?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that nature builds worlds is that it builds the physical world first. It builds the environment. And then if life takes root in that world, and it's, stories are always more interesting if there are living things, those living things are adapted to the environment. And then culture that happens for those life forms is a consequence of what those life forms need and what they have available. So it's like a waterfall effect where environment informs biology, which informs culture, and it's cyclical too. So I can start at either end, but my favorite way to start is thinking of different astronomical possibilities.
Sure.
I think you'll see if you go to the early episodes of Exolore that all of the worlds I built were different astronomy worlds.
Yeah.
Like there was the world without a sun, there was the world with multiple moons, there was the world with a variable star, and because I was originally using Exolore as a science communication tool to like teach people how astronomy works and how astronomy affects your everyday life, that made most sense to me.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, something that kind of jumps out at me as well, because when I build my worlds, a lot of the time, something that's so important to me as a storyteller is what don't people know as well.
Yes.
I think that, and this I guess is tapping a bit more on your folklore side, but like I had an entire campaign in a world in which there were cryptids and things like that, just the way we know them. But there was also this other sort of occurrence, these monsters that kept happening that didn't seem to come from a biological process. Ooh. And what it was that underneath this mountain, there was an extra dimensional being that was like so big that it spanned dimensions in a way that we can't quite process. And like essentially it being there was trying to like put itself back together again in some sort of conceivable way. And so that intention was actually creating these like agents that were trying to, cause that to happen.
It was like manifesting them into this reality. Love that.
Right. And so for me, I was like, okay, people in this world don't know that this thing is there, because that would be horrifying. And that also they also don't think that these other things, even though they are real. They have sort of they've explained it away.
Okay.
And so they have taken away that sort of like base biological knowledge of these other creatures and said like they're so rare that they probably don't exist. They're legend, they're folklore, and so I pushed them off to the side.
Oh, interesting.
And so both of those things then informs the entire campaign of these three people that knew that not only did the cryptid sort of things exist, but also this other thing was happening, and they had to figure out why.
Yeah.
So when you approach your world building, do you ever have like a question that you stumble on and you're like, this is actually a really important question that we shouldn't like touch for a while because it's more like informative that people don't know what this is yet.
When you say people, do you mean people within the world or the people
Yes.
consuming the... Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really... that's where you get a lot of interesting stories. That is where a lot of folklore happens. So to get there, you have to think about why people tell myths in the first place. Like why do these cultural stories exist? And there are a few reasons. One is pure entertainment. Like you're sitting around a fire. Imagine, 2,000 years ago, you're sitting around a fire. You don't have TV. You don't have TikTok. What are you going to do? You're going to listen to some old person tell a nice story for a few hours. And so some myths are that. But a lot of myths are educational. They teach people how you're supposed to act in a particular society. So there are social norms that are getting translated through these stories. And then there's education about the world around you. So many myths were humankind's attempts at explaining the natural world that they observed. So when I'm going to use your world as an example. Yeah. If there are these people who see these creatures popping up, they would tell stories about them to explain where they came from or explain what they were trying to do. And it is so believable to me that people who didn't see those things but heard those stories would dismiss it as just maybe an entertaining story or maybe a lie or something. So yeah, I think that type of texture that you can add to your world where you as the creator know this one thing and you know that some people in the world know it too, but not everyone does, that's realistic.
Yeah.
In our real world, there are things that I know that other people don't. There are things that other people know that I don't. It's great. That's how real worlds work.
And it's really interesting in a game context as well because I have a friend whose game I play in, and what he really loves to do is to build ecosystems. So what animals eat what other animals, and like build a food chain essentially.
Cool.
And then as you start to flesh out that food chain, then you can say, okay, so these would be around these creatures, and since these are aquatic, maybe these ones would always be like in this area near the river or whatever, like that. And like since these things are scarce, maybe these things are really hungry, and maybe that's why that they're the monsters that you fight in your campaign or whatever. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I also think that it's really interesting when you can use science to kind of transpose game mechanics onto them as well.
Yeah.
So if you were to try to build a world when it comes to interaction, so if people are going to be interacting with this world, they're going to be shaking the cage a little bit. How do you how do you have any suggestions or steps or things that you would suggest to leave or build into your world that can allow for people to really be interacting and pushing on it a little bit?
Ooh, great question. So if you're like building a sandbox world that you just want people to play in, I mean, put a lot of stuff in it.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, so like I am a very visual person, so I love starting from maps of places. Look at a map. I know that different TTRPGs, they can provide maps, or you can make your own. So look at your map and plot out how you think the story or the game or the campaign will go, and just like put fun stuff along that path. Also make sure you put stuff off of that path because you know that people are going to deviate from it.
Yeah, instead of going on the adventure, they're going to haggle with the shopkeep for 3 hours.
Yes, yes, you'll get deep into the weeds of your currency. So put things on that path and try not to build it out too much. World building can get very overwhelming. It's so easy to just like add and like do world building for hours. I think it's really important to just do a first sketch of something. If the thing that you're putting on the path is a creature, decide what the most important like physical and mental features of that creature are, so that you know how it will interact with the people in your party. If it's a place, then try and, if you're a visual person, picture the place in your mind. Like, what information does your party need to know about this place? If it's a task, like, I don't know. I think that starting with the first layer, the first sketchy layer, is a lot easier than trying to add all the detail before the game starts, because one, you might not even come across it, and then you've just done all that work for almost nothing.
Yeah, right.
And two, I don't know, you're playing this game, the characters are improvising, like the players are improvising. It might be fun for you to do a little improvising too, and you can play off of what the characters and the players say.
Totally. Yeah, we had a whole episode about just saying yes and like the improv experience, essentially. But another thing that I'm really interested to kind of pick your brain about is when you go from a full world and like how it functions within a scientific system, and then you kind of zoom in to cultures and societies. Do you have any sort of like ideas or frameworks that's really good to consider when talking about those? Because like I do love the if this is true, then what else is true, which is another improv sort of idea that you can apply with your scientific creation that you've had, or your science-based world. But do you have anything that you really like to use? Any tips and tricks for creating interesting and like fleshed out cultures and societies?
Yeah. Number one rule, no culture is a monolith. So whatever you decide, know that there are going to be people who are still part of that culture, but go against the grain.
Yeah.
When I'm starting to build a culture, I really love starting from what they value. And there's this thing called the moral foundations theory. I think it's a psychological theory that splits up what people morally value, and it gives you a bunch of spectra, and it says on a scale from like honesty to lying, or what do they value, and it has a bunch of those options. I love starting from there. So start from what they value, and that will tell you basically how they behave, and then if you add into that what they have available, that will tell you how they do what they do, if that makes sense. Like if you have life forms that need to eat,
sure,
and you know that they need to just because of their biology, well, part of culture is cuisine, and so see what they have available. Do they have a lot of animals? Do they have a lot of spices available? Is it a very cold climate and they do a lot of fishing? Like that's what I start with.
Yeah, resources, because also like resources is such an interesting thing to track when you're creating a culture or society too, because when at least humans have an abundance of resources, we sort of spend them to do easier things that we could do right quickly and easily, even though we don't have to spend the resources to do them. And I think that it's something to keep in mind, is like how, if it is a really abundant society, then how kind of generous, I guess, would they be with using resources to get whatever task that they have to do day to day done. Yeah,
and often everything that's the opposite is also possible. You know, like if you have a society that has really abundant resources, maybe they just spend and consume because the resources seem endless. But there's also the flip side of that. Maybe they have so many resources now because they have been stingy in the past. Yeah,
it's interesting. It's like, it's sort of putting on that binary that you were talking about, that if exactly that
moral
if one is
foundation
true,
theory,
then the other one is also true at the same time, but just in like a transposed time or place. Or I think that's really smart, because then you can. One thing I always think is hard for folks when they're creating a world, especially when they have to improvise within it, is to create complexity when it comes to both characters and societies and things like that. But I also sadly think that the best stories and experiences we have within those societies is when we get to kind of come up against the duality and the complexity and have to make decisions based on what we ourselves think rather than what we are told, and we have that chance to kind of put our values into the game in some way. So I think that's really smart to have those both at the same time.
That's awesome. And that, I think, is one big difference in world building for like a book, for example, versus world building for an RPG.
Yeah, it's because
Yeah.
it's so easy to say. And like in a previous episode of Tabletop, I talked to one of my hosts about how when you are making sort of like a oppositional force, that instead of making it a person or a type of person, to make it a belief or a belief system, because then you actually have a chance to really question more of like the moral fundamentals of life, rather than that person is bad, we're gonna like put him in jail or whatever. And I think that by building your world in this way, that you are setting yourself up to be unable to do the one person, one problem sort of thing. Because if a society believes a certain way and that's a problem, then you have to address the societal ill or the societal problem, which is, I think, great.
Yeah, and if you are working into your world that there are interactions between people from different cultures, the strongest clashes will be between cultures that exist at polar opposite ends of one of those moral spectra. Like a society that really values strength, when it butts up against a society that really values smarts, for example. That's a simple example, but that's where you find some of the most interesting conflict,
and if you are, so going back to sort of like, I guess, science-y stuff for a second. If you have a game system, sort of like Dungeons and Dragons, for example, that has a book that, while setting up your game, it's going to provide you with like 10 plus species to pick from for your characters and things like that. As a world, we are only experienced with a monolithic, intelligent species that kind of rules over the species below it because we have intelligence. How would you go about, in your kind of like scientific opinion, to make a world that can accommodate a bunch of those at the same time? Because you're both having sort of the vertical hierarchy where there are monsters of like low intelligence or no intelligence that everyone is sort of dealing with. But then there's also the lateral hierarchy of all these people that have, similar to intelligence and skills and ability to deal with problems and evolutionary traits, I guess. So how would you go about creating a world that can accommodate that breadth of species, I guess?
Love this question. There are a couple ways. I recently finished Sarah J. Maas's Crescent City #2 book, House of Sky and Breath, I think it's called. And I don't want to give too much away, but in that book, you do see in this world there are shapeshifters, there are angels, there are fae, there are demons and humans. And this is a little
spoiler alert, everyone turn it off.
Sorry, spoiler alert. Fast forward 10 seconds. You learn that all of these different creatures came from different worlds. So you can have the model where the different species evolved in different places and then came to this one central location. If you don't want to go that route and you want to have all of your different species originating in the same world, have a world with a lot of different ecosystems. And especially if those ecosystems are relatively isolated from each other, then it would make sense that life forms would evolve on each of those different ecosystems. And then because it's the same world and they're all still, like breathing the same atmosphere, it makes it easier for them to interact.
That's so interesting. I think that's a great way to do it too, because for people who really like to world build, it does also give you a chance to world build 20 plus worlds from where all these people came from, and then settled on this like one that has a similar trait for them to all survive on.
Yeah, for sure.
I think
that's
great.
That's
and
what
so
I want to say about that.
What are leaving that a little bit, what are the basics of folklore? Like we've talked a little bit about how they are educational in nature and that people told stories for a purpose, and not just purely for entertainment. So when you're kind of building a folklore in one of your cultures or society or whatever in your world, what are things that you like to consider to start building those stories and building those either pantheons or whatever it is that you need to build?
Yes. The values. If I'll go back to the strength versus smarts. In the strength, like the physical strength society, they might have a lot more war deities. They might have more deities that have to do with the body, whereas the smart culture might care more about dialogue and conversation, and so they might have more deities that have to do with that and like learning. So think about what they value. Think about the resources they have available, and just some like things that you should think about when you are building out a folklore and culture. What are their holidays? And remember what holiday means. It is a holy day. What do they value so much that they would choose to take a break on a holy day to worship this thing? And how do they do that? And the resources that they have available will determine how they do that. Try to think about what like their children's bedtime stories might be. What legends and myths do the kids in this world grow up with? Because that affects a lot. Like, I am of the Disney generation. I go through the world with expectations that Disney built with all of its animated movies. So the children's stories are important. Think about the art they have, the clothes they wear, the food they eat. When I teach world building workshops, I have an image of a culture wheel and a culture iceberg. Have you heard of the cultural iceberg?
I've seen sort of the iceberg to, generally represent, the small bit that's visible and then all of the subconscious or the other things. But I don't know in this case exactly what it is. So if you would love to explain. Oh, that's it. I did it.
No, that is exactly what I mean. You did it. Congrats. So if culture is an iceberg, imagine you fly to a country that you've never been to before. When you step off the plane, there are going to be things that you can easily identify as different from what you're used to. The dress, the language, the clothes. But there's going to be so much of that culture that you can't see right away and that you may never be able to see if you're not a part of it. Like humor, manners, family relations. Those things are below the waterline on the iceberg, but you still have to think about those in your world to make it feel rich.
This is so interesting to me because I'm an improviser as well, and I work with a comedy theater and have a team there. But one thing that I've been noticing so much recently is that the amount that our jobs and how capitalism has sort of kind of made our minds work to be like, associate this with this. And how we, like, you walk into a scene and you're like, oh, hey, groundskeeper or whatever. And that immediately means something. And I've been really trying very hard to disassociate a job's importance or a job being essential to the dramatic tension of a scene, because I feel like, wow, I've really internalized this. So how do you build something into your world that is so internalized but is maybe an external factor? You know what I mean?
Interesting. Yeah. This is making me think of introductions, like when you introduce yourself. And I have been watching a lot of Love Island.
Who hasn't, honestly?
Lately.
Very good.
Right? I know that the last episode came out today because I saw it on Twitter.
Yeah,
and I was like, no, cannot see. Yeah. And this is making me think of how people introduce themselves, because on Love Island they say, oh, I'm Dammy, I'm from Ireland, right? They say where they're from because that's really important to who they are. And in the US, we tend to be like, I'm Moiya, I'm a science communicator. We say what we do. And so introductions is one way that you can show what information people have internalized about themselves and what they think is important to
that's so
communicate
cool.
to the world.
I think that is so smart as a place to start from, even of like, okay, how would my character introduce themselves to, like, if you're not even world building, you're just building a character, how would my character introduce themselves? What do they value enough to put in the first thing that they want somebody to know about them? I think that's like very, very interesting and cool. So that's brilliant.
Yeah. Thank you. I recently built a world on Exolore full of bat bats. It was a species inspired by bats. And when they introduce themselves, they sing a song that encodes information about the places they've traveled to.
So I learned a long time ago that we are sort of the bacterial makeup of our body is an amalgamation of every single person that we've ever known, because when we like handshake or touch or kiss or whatever, whenever we have a relationship with somebody, we are actually getting some of their bacteria into our bacterial ecosystem. And so at any given moment, we are just the amalgamation of all of the experiences and relationships that we've all had, made like, biologically tangible, which I've always thought is like such a cool, beautiful thing.
Yeah. That's amazing. Imagine a world where you meet someone, you swap some spit, and all of a sudden, each of you knows who the other one knows.
Yeah, the relational web that would go out would be so cool. So now... So we've talked a lot about things that you can do to start inspiring these thoughts and some places to start. Do you have some like hard don'ts when you're building a world? Like this is like don't do that. Because I know that creativity thrives within, not boundaries, but limitations. So
right. At the very beginning of the process, no, I don't think there are any hard don'ts. Once you get further along in the process and you've made some decisions, there are absolutely don'ts. So I'd say the reason I say that intention is so important at the beginning is because it helps guide you away from the don'ts, right? If you are setting up a world based on your intention, you then establish the rules of that world. And I guess I would say the only don't I have is don't break the rules of your world.
So when you're establishing core rules, and I know we talked a little bit about this at the beginning, but what would you say are like core unbreakable rules once you've decided upon them? Okay, great.
I mean, everything you decide is unbreakable, right? So, I mean, I've watched fantasy shows where they have a rule that magic is passed down biologically, and then at the end of the series, it's revealed that there's this magical character, but we know who their parents are, and their parents don't have magic. Like that's a fundamental rule break in my mind. If you have established a world where faster than light travel is possible, if you have established a world where faster than light travel is not possible, like don't then have people traveling. But if it is possible, not everyone would have access to that technology, so it's okay for people to travel slower than light. I don't know. I think that just write down your rules at the beginning and then
totally.
And then follow
one thing that kind of spurned in me was so in the Western tradition of storytelling, we really like to have sort of like chosen one figures that kind of come out and are like, I am the person. I'm not really a huge proponent of that. I think that ensembles are way more interesting than any individual can be. But if you have something where you're trying to accommodate exceptions, like you said, this world magic works like this, but in this weird way, this one person is able to kind of bend those rules, and thus we are kind of guided by how we are taught to listen to stories to like focus on that one character as like an anomaly. How do you accommodate exceptions? Not maybe breaking the rules, but exceptions to the rules, and like how would you go about that?
Yeah. First is being careful about what parts of the rule you tell the audience. And I have, at this point, done a few episodes with Clark Rowanson, who calls himself the magic system engineer. He builds magic systems from scratch. And one step in his process is to think about what perspective you're using as you build the magic system. And you've heard of hard versus soft magic and sci-fi. He also adds another axis, rational versus
It's a really great
irrational.
episode if people want to go pop over there and take a quick listen. I really enjoyed I listened to the first two. I thought that was like a really cool matrix that he came up with, essentially like, does this magic make sense or does it not make sense? I thought was very funny and very good.
Yeah, thank you for listening. It is a great episode. And so he really shifted my thinking in this, because there are times when, as an audience member, you might think that the rules are being broken, but there's actually some other rule that the creator of the piece knows that you don't. So I think it's really important to from both sides, from the creator and the consumer perspective, be careful about the point of view. It's fun to be nitpicky of worlds, but you have to remember that you don't always know everything about the world that you're consuming. Just as, like you said earlier, if you are a member of that world, you wouldn't know everything and how everything works necessarily. So I did say earlier that it was a hard don't not to break rules, but if you write in exceptions to your rules, then have fun with it and bring that out later and let it be a surprise for the audience.
Yeah, I think that's so such a good way to go about it. The thing that I'm debating internally about what to do is so I am also a pretty big proponent of when you are doing interactive storytelling and you sit down at a table that you should tell everyone your secrets as a player, because then everyone is able to tell a better story knowing your secrets. So your character, they can sort of steer things so that your character will have better dramatic stakes and things like that. So that, and
interesting.
The characters inside the world won't know the secrets, but everyone playing them and kind of puppeting them around will, and will be able to make better choices based on that. More dramatic choices at the very least. And so now I'm kind of debating myself with, as a storyteller, is it better to say, oh, right, this is why your character is like this, and these are the rules, and this is why your character has this special power or whatever it is? Or is it better to, as a storyteller, be I don't know why that's happening, that's very strange, and just let them sort of come up with some sort of thoughts on their own? It's a really interesting sort of debate I'm having.
Yeah, and in one campaign you can do it one way, and in the next you can flip it. This is the beauty of TTRPGs, that you can make up the rules. If you're playing from a game book, you can decide what to keep and what to throw out. I think this session that I had this past weekend, we played very loose. I didn't even keep track of the number of spells I had used. We just wanted to play in this fun world, and you can do that with RPGs.
I'm always kind of trying to evangelize other systems other than D&D, but if you're interested in things like that, there are other ones it's called Apocalypse World, and it's a 2d6 system. So you just have two 6-sided dice, and when you roll them, everything up to a 6 is a failure, which means that the person who's running the game gets to narrate what happens. A 7 through 9 means a mixed success, so you do what you want to do, but something bad is happening too. So it's sort of oh man, that didn't happen as well as I wanted to. Anything above that is just a complete success. You did the thing. Congratulations. And so it really allows you to have a much looser way of going about storytelling as well, because you're able to just be yeah, I want to do this with magic. Is there a spell? No, but I'm doing this. And then you throw the dice and then see what happens. Yeah.
I love that.
It's very fun.
That's a nice mechanic.
Thank you so much for coming on and talking about all of this. We've sort of gone through the do's. So start with intention, starting with making sure that you're focused on a specific objective you want to achieve with your world. Some of the don'ts, don't break the rules once you make them. Is there anything else that you want to impart when it comes to world building directly to our audience from the master of world building herself? I'm building this pedestal one brick at a time. I took you down a notch when I revealed that you were a theater kid, but we're building you back up.
I think being a theater kid only puts you higher. I do have a parting message. Even if you are rooting your world in science, it is not as limiting as you think it is. I think that this is especially noticeable in the biology part of the world building process that I use. Even if you are basing everything 100% on evolutionary biology, there's so much randomness in the world. Nature is random. There's random genetic drift. There are genetic mutations. There are people with different sets of genetics moving into environments. So have fun with it. like be creative and question your assumptions. What metal is more valuable? What's the word?
Yeah.
Fight against those default assumptions. Who carries the baby? What it means to have a baby? How tall people are? Like, have fun. It's a world. You're the world's
I feel like
god. Do whatever you
want.
want.
The more that we can extract our biases and prejudices from for how a world is supposed to work, like you said, you did a world that didn't orbit a star. It's like that's pretty fundamental to Earth and like how we we perceive the world through light. That's like a very fundamental thing. The more that we can abstract out those biases, I think the more freedom and the more interesting things you can come up with. So that's a really great point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it sorry
keep going.
to add to it, but it's useful in our own world too. That world that didn't orbit a star, I built that world with 3 blind guests. And on that world, because sight isn't the default, blindness isn't even a concept that exists. And now when I think about accessibility in this world, I think about that one and how we can bring aspects of that more accessible world into our own reality.
I had a really great guest on a little while ago named Margaret Clark, who was really talking about making accessible and inviting tables and how when you are running a game to really make sure that you are not only accommodating what people are interested in and what they want to express about themselves and who they are and what they can do and what they can't do, things like that, but also to really make an active choice over like you said earlier, making a world where queer people didn't have to face prejudice and things like that. Like those are options, and like we don't have to live in the bad parts of our world all the time. Like we can make up some bad things that are happening if we need to, but like especially when the people who are sitting down at your table might have like trauma or might have some real deep feelings when it comes to certain parts of those, that accessibility and making your world free to be a safe place is also important. So, yeah. Well, thank you so much. Yeah. I'm so excited to come on Exolore and talk about a world. I actually think I have an idea for the intention to start out with. Maybe off mics I can tell you about it. But also, I would really love for you to plug your book again, because it sounds super cool. And I'm sure that we've already had an ad read, but I really want to hear from you what this book is, what it's about, where people can find it, and when.
Yes. The book is called The Milky Way, an autobiography of our galaxy, and it is written from the galaxy's perspective. The Milky Way is telling its own story after billions of years of listening to other things tell its story. So it talks about the evolution, the formation and evolution of the galaxy, but also the evolution of our human understanding of it, from mythology to sending telescopes up into space. And it's fun, it's sassy, it's snarky, and you can find it anywhere books are sold, as long as it's
That's
after
a good
August
caveat
16th.
to put on. Yes, the book comes out August 16th. I'm really excited to read it. Dr. Moiya McTier, thank you so much for coming on. Everyone, go check out Exolore. It is a great listen, and hopefully one day we'll have you back on again.
Yeah, I'd love that. And if you do listen to Exolore, you will hear Nick's voice there
I'm
very
nervous.
soon.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Yep, bye.
To our website, tabletoppedpod.com, or you can become a subscriber on our Patreon at patreon.com/tabletopped. There's a ton of extra content and more on the way. As always, everyone, we can't do this without you, and it's so nice to have a community of like-minded folks. So thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.